Hey everybody, welcome back to our APES flipped classroom where we're nearing the end of our land and water use section of the course. And today we're talking about urbanization and the impact that urbanization and that cities themselves have on our environment. So first, before we can really talk about what the impacts of urbanization are, we need to talk about what urbanization is. So urbanization is just the process of creation of a city. So that means we're removing vegetation, whether that is wild vegetation, wild areas, or whether that is the conversion of farmland. Either way, we are converting landscape to city. So when we urbanize, when we create city areas, we replace soil, we replace vegetation, we frequently fill in wetlands, and we replace all of that with what are called impervious surfaces, meaning that water does not penetrate into them. So these are things like concrete, asphalt, and they don't allow, and buildings themselves, and they don't allow water to infiltrate into the ground. And so urbanization has a huge impact on water management. So if we look at a natural area versus an urban area, and we talk about stormwater drainage, so when you have a big rainstorm, then in a natural area, about 50% of that water is going to infiltrate into the ground, some of it deeply, some of it shallow, and about 50% of it is going to be split between evaporation and runoff. The plants and the trees work to hold soil in place. They absorb the stormwater. They allow water to sit on the surface long enough that it can then infiltrate into the ground. Whereas in a city setting where you have much more impervious surface cover, only about 15% of water actually penetrates into the ground, and very, very little goes into what we call deep infiltration. So that's the water that replenishes aquifers. Instead, 85% of that rain is not penetrating into the ground. About 55% of it is simply running off, and 30% is lost to evaporation. So you actually have less evaporation in a natural environment as well, because water's not sitting on the surface, so there's not as much time to evaporate. It just runs off. And that runoff goes into the sewers. And so we have a lot of impacts with runoff. We don't replenish aquifers. It does pick up all of those pollutants and carries those pollutants into whatever body of water it runs off into. And obviously you have less going to evaporation as well to replenish our natural water. So we don't have that groundwater recharge. This leads to depletion of aquifers. You also have the pollution that comes along with runoff. You guys might remember when we took our trip that we talked about the impact of runoff on turbidity of rivers and streams. And that can actually be seen from space. Another impact of urbanization is an increase in carbon dioxide emissions, and that's for a lot of different reasons. One of them, which we'll talk about a little bit when we talk about urban sprawl, is just the amount of driving that's involved with city environments. So the burning of fossil fuels, but also the production of cement is the second leading cause of carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere after only combustion of fossil fuels. In the process of building a city, of course, there's lots of construction machinery. So that also burns a lot of fossil fuels. When we cut down forested areas to build cities, we lose that future carbon sequestration. Plus, we also have the decomposition of any of the cut trees. And then another big piece of urbanization carbon dioxide emissions is landfills. So landfills are big carbon dioxide and methane emitters as the trash decomposes. And when you have a large population, you need lots of landfills. And so we have significant carbon dioxide emissions there as well. And then one other major contributor to environmental issues of urbanization is the thing we call the heat island effect. So again, that those surfaces which are impervious are also, generally speaking, very low albedo surfaces. So that means that they don't reflect a lot of sunlight. They absorb a lot of sunlight. You've probably all had the experience of walking across hot pavement in the summertime, and you know just how much of the sun's energy it absorbs. So when we talk about cities, we often talk about them as heat islands because all of those dark surfaces absorb heat in a way that natural surfaces don't. And so cities can be as much as 5 to 10 degrees warmer than the surrounding non-urban areas. So we have a heat island effect, actually creates microclimates within the cities. So in coastal cities, urbanization also has another significant impact because in coastal cities, as we draw down our groundwater, it lowers the water table pressure within the aquifer, which allows salt water to seep into that aquifer to pollute, essentially, the fresh water of the aquifer. And that's just because there's not the pressure because of overpumping. In addition, saltwater intrusion can also be caused by sea level rise. That's not necessarily an urbanization problem, but I do want to point it out since we're talking about saltwater intrusion, that there are two major reasons for saltwater intrusion in coastal areas. One is overpumping of aquifers, which is usually associated with urbanization, but it also can be caused by sea level rise, which then will contaminate aquifers with saltwater as well. Okay, so urbanization has a lot of impacts on the environment, but there are also good things about urban areas when it comes to environmental impacts. So let's talk about trends in population. So the overall trend in the US and most developed nations is away from a less rural area and towards a more urban area. Our population, as we go through that demographic transition, goes from a rural farm-based economy and a rural farm-based population to a industrial economy and most people living in or near cities. So why do people do this? We move from rural areas to urban areas for jobs, for entertainment, for cultural attractions. Urban areas tend to be more densely populated. So on the plus side for urban areas, that tends to minimize driving. It does tend to minimize land use per person. And that actually decreases the environmental impact per person if we have what we call smart cities. Currently in the US, and again in a lot of developed countries, the highest growth area is suburban population. So suburban is the suburbs, right? These are less dense areas that surround our urban areas. So here, if we consider Norfolk to be the city, our suburban areas are Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, Suffolk. And that suburban population is growing. So the thing about the suburban population is that it is all of those negatives that we associate with the urban, plus some other environmental issues. So we talk about urban sprawl. This is talking about the population movement out of these dense urban centers to these less dense suburban areas. So this happens because property values are lower. So there's cheaper property in the suburbs. People can get more house for the same price. And of course, here in the US, cars make it really easy for us to still get into the cities. We're close by. We can still get to the entertainment. We can still get to work, cultural attractions, but without living in the city itself. And then another piece of urban sprawl is what we call the domino effect. So as your neighbors leave, people move out of the city. That creates the domino effect of everybody moving out of the city. And this domino effect keeps going because as there are fewer residents in the cities, that's going to lead to a decline in the tax revenue for the city, which will lead to a decrease in city services, which of course is going to make more people move out to the suburbs. And so we have this positive feedback loop. As the residents leave, the businesses follow. Nobody wants to live in the city because there's no businesses there, and the suburbs keep growing. So unlike city life, where a well-designed city can actually reduce the driving per person, reduce the footprint, actual physical footprint, space that people take up, suburbs increase the amount of driving and increase the amount of land use per person. Of course, nobody wants to live in a blighted area. As people and businesses leave, we have rundown infrastructure, more people leave, and that's contributing again to that positive feedback loop. Not a positive thing, but a positive feedback loop. So what causes, continuing the idea of what causes urban sprawl, well, we have this amazing, fantastic highway system in the United States that makes travel easier, and easier travel gets, the more we drive. The more we drive, the more we pay in fuel taxes. That's used to build more highways, which makes it easier and easier to commute from the suburbs into the urban areas. And we see this in our area that we are constantly expanding and improving on our interstate infrastructure, and we just kind of continue with that process. So what are some solutions? There are definitely solutions here. We can create what are called urban growth boundaries. Sometimes you hear these called green lines. And these are zoning laws that are set by cities that prevent development beyond a certain boundary. So Suffolk actually has a green line south of a certain area and west of a certain area. In Suffolk, you can't have the development of housing. It has to be kept either as farm area or wild area. Creating walkable city designs and increasing and improving public transport attracts residents to keep them in those urban areas. And this is certainly something that you're seeing in the city of Norfolk, in our area, that 30 years ago, well, 40 years ago, you would not want to walk around in downtown Norfolk. And yet now we have a thriving business district, thriving restaurants, a nightlife community, and it's become a much more positive area. And a lot of that has to do with city design, creating walkable areas, promoting businesses to come back into the city. And then another solution is, whether you're talking about in urban areas or even in suburban areas, creating what they call mixed land use communities. And these are areas where you have residential and business and entertainment buildings all located in the same area of a city. And this creates a sense of place. It enables walkability. You guys can probably think of several examples where you live. I know in the Harborview section of Suffolk that there are areas where there are restaurants, apartments, grocery stores, doctors' offices, all within walking distance of each other. Suffolk is attempting to create that same thing in the old Obacy area near downtown Suffolk. And when they're well designed, they're very appealing to people. And they also help to mitigate a lot of the environmental issues. All right, so your practice FRQ for this one is to describe a possible solution to the issue of urban sprawl, but also to identify one possible economic consequence of that solution. All right, that's it for today. As always, I look forward to seeing you in class, and let me know if you have any questions.